Okay, moving on to state building and the diplomatic developments taking place in Europe and between European powers. We start in essentially the middle of the century with the Crimean War, pitting Russia against the Ottoman Empire over disputes in the Black Sea region and Caucasus Mountains. These were two regional powers that were rather desperate for victory in order to demonstrate their legitimacy as a viable member to deciding matters in Europe's balance of power, and kind of demonstrating their relevancy, essentially. Um, Again, you'll remember that the Ottoman Empire was in various states of decline. It had retreated from the walls of Vienna and had been pushed back into the and through the Balkans, basically clinging on to the south uh, eastern portions of Europe, kind of maintaining a toehold really. As for Russia, with what you've been um, seeing with Lucy Worsley's documentary on Tsarist Russia in her three-part series, essentially Russia always was struggling with not only maintaining control over its vast population and territorial claims, but then also trying to, exert itself on the international stage. So it's really these two powers that are, you know, essentially fighting with one another for, becoming accentuating their own power at the expense of, becoming the second weakest power, you might say, in the European balance of power. The Austro-Hungarian Empire remained neutral to a large extent in the early stages of this conflict, but eventually they committed to policies that hurt Russia's war effort. In 1854, France and Britain joined in the conflict on the side of the Ottomans. This is essentially driven by geopolitics. France and Britain are concerned about who would have domain over the Dardanelles, basically the straits that connected the Black Sea with the Aegean Sea and more broadly into the Mediterranean Sea. The Ottoman, French, and British victory in the Crimean region, what is today kind of this southern kind of uh, landmass in Ukraine, spelled defeat for Russia, essentially. And in the Treaty of Paris of 1856, which would end this conflict, the Crimean War, we see an erosion, the beginning of cracks to emerge within the concert of European or Europe system. Russia and Austro-Hungary were enemies at the end of this war in all intents and purposes. You see a contraction of interventionist type of interests in the balance of power that had been established as a result of the concert. On the one hand, Austro-Hungary was friendless, it couldn't be trusted as a result of its policies and courses of action taken during the Crimean War. Also, Russia turned inward as well after its humiliating defeat, and this allowed for new forces to coalesce and exert influence. You have the unification, particularly of Italy, and the unification of Germany as modern um, national powers rising in the central portion of Europe. Uh, these powers were not represented, obviously, in the concert of Europe, and so what you have is the further destabilizing of the balance of power. And again, this is pretty typical in diplomatic history that when peace arrives after conflict, and if there's a redistribution of power, if there's a new balance of power that's established afterward, then essentially what happens is that this begins to break down over time because the circumstances begin to change that don't or are not represented um, at the time that this new balance of power took place, and so therefore it is not viable or lose its resiliency essentially. Britain and France, for their part, consolidated their international claims after the war. For example, Britain proceeded to continue to consolidate control over Egypt in particular. German and Italian entities began to kind of coagulate to become the new kind of nations in the central parts of Europe. In 1861, you have the Italian king Victor Emmanuel II, aided by Count Camillo di Cavour and Giuseppe Garibaldi, two figures that are going to help the king, the Italian monarch, achieve a unified Italian nation. Now, Emmanuel II and Cavour were moderate constitutionalists. They were obviously supporters of the monarchy, one being the king, the other being the prime minister. Garibaldi was a Republican with, again, a lowercase r. He believed in kind of more populist or more popular representation in government. So there was this compromise reached as the northern and southern portions of the Italian peninsula began to come together under one flag and one banner, one nation, and as a result, there were, kind of certain compromises made between these various ideological perspectives. In addition to consolidating control over the Italian peninsula, Sicily was also incorporated into the Italian nation. This all really happened at the expense of the French and Austro-Hungarian states that had, by and large, exerted themselves in their influence, particularly over the northern portions of Italy, and the Italian, kind of the anchor of the Italian peninsula. In 1871, through a series of brief conflicts, Kaiser Wilhelm I and Chancellor Otto von Bismarck are going to secure a new modern German nation. Now, Bismarck, governing from the strong Prussian state, subdued smaller Germanic states, and also was successful at provoking war with Austria in 1866. This allowed for Prussia, for Kaiser Wilhelm I and Bismarck to unify northern regions of the Germanic-speaking people, basically just south of Denmark, so that Prussia had unified these Germanic entities under, again, a kind of a burgeoning, expansive state. Not content with that, by 1870, France was becoming increasingly alarmed with and by the growth of the Prussian state and influence. However, at this time, France was weakened internally by a series of revolts and periods of unrest. This led to the dissolution of the Second Republic in 1852, from which France continued to kind of try and recover, essentially. Louis Napoleon proclaimed himself emperor, much in kind of copying his ancestor. Napoleon Bonaparte. And in the midst of this kind of internal political instability and tumult that was taking place, French forces went to war against Prussia and were essentially defeated within a matter of weeks. So much so that by 1871, in the peace that followed, the German nation, the German state was established, and therefore also establishing by decree the Second Reich. The ramifications from all this were, one, that Louis Napoleon, was deposed. The French established their own Third Republic. So they had been through a series in the first, you know, 2/3 essentially of the of the 19th century. Here, France is really kind of in a political mess. Going through at least three different systems, three different types of government, you know, within a 75-year span or 70-year span. Now, page 541 of your textbook gives the map there really depicts a consolidated state of Europe. It really kind of shows how things looked essentially during this period of time. And for the remainder of the 19th century, these countries would maneuver themselves diplomatically, which helped set the stage for a series of alliances that would trigger World War I. So what we're talking about here are secret agreements between these major European powers that were often had collective kind of security clauses to them, so that if one state was attacked, then their ally would come to their aid in helping to defend against any potential adversary that their ally went to war with. And this has really, by 1914, a cascading effect, which helps to have this kind of lead to this major event, World War I. So these characteristics, you can see, are help define the issues of the 20th century. You have social stratification, as we discussed, coming about as a result of industrialization. You have the rise of women's rights, pursuit of suffrage, the vote essentially for women to have a political voice. This is mostly in the case in the area of France and Britain primarily. You also have workers' rights coming to the fore during this century as well, as expressed in the failed revolutions of 1848. This also kind of lends to examples where you may have events take place that are failures. However, they are, because they fail, they're not necessarily the end of the movements that were such as this pursuit of workers' interests. They often would help to define and expand the scope and the call for their interests being represented. In the case of Marxism, that is going to be a pretty dominant, pretty popular ideology that's going to have a tremendous impact on the 20th century. There's also a philosophical kind of recalibration, reorientation, you might say, with the rise of Romanticism and the kind of effort to reconnect with human empathy, feeling, emotion, in order to kind of escape and broaden the meaning of human existence by breaking free, essentially, of the reasoned, rational, enlightened thinking that dominated much and most of the industrial age. There's also an imperial identity that's beginning to reach kind of a fever pitch in Europe as well. And this emerged, not surprisingly, along nationalist lines and often held pretty conservative leanings as far as political expression were concerned. There was this effort to struggle to maintain control over changes that were brought about by industrialization and the social fallout from it, you know, i.e., the revolutions of 1848. But it also, this nationalist, imperialist type of sentiment also intensified competition between the major powers of Europe themselves. And of course, this would have global consequences. We'll see this in the coming lectures and other kind of posted material in the course content. So, but that's kind of a theme that's going to really come to dominate the rest of our topics here in the last week or so of coursework that we have to cover. All right. So, kind of a broad brush approach to defining characteristics of 19th century Europe, but hopefully it gives you an idea, helps to complement your readings in the textbook and the other supplemental materials. So, next, I'll be turning attention to the kind of international or non-Western developments that are in many ways parallel to what we've been discussing, a focus on nationalistic kind of pursuits in the case of Japan with the Meiji Restoration, but also other peoples, populations that are the victims of this kind of intense nationalistic approach, namely China, which we'll take a look at as well. All right, see you next time.